those national stereotypes about our noble region. My name is Josh Mizell. I'm one of the co-directors, co-founders of the Humboldt Institute for Interdisciplinary Marijuana Research. We are hosting, sponsoring this speaker series. This is, I believe, the 5th speaker public talk event in our first annual speaker series. We have 2 more speakers coming up, which I'm going to say something more about. But in case you want to learn more information about our institute, our mission, what our objectives are, the kinds of activities we're involved in, please visit us online, of course, right? At humboldt.edu/HIIMR. We have a website. A couple of upcoming events I wanted to make you aware of before I introduce our speaker this evening. Our next speaker series is going to be, our next public talk will be at the end of March, and that will be on March 25th, and it will actually be on a Monday evening. Most of the talks have been on Tuesday evenings. And I'm pretty excited personally about this speaker because this is my old advisor when I was an undergraduate at UC Santa Cruz, a sociologist by the name of Craig Reinerman, who's going to be giving a talk on developments in Dutch drug policy. It's the Netherlands moving toward U.S.-style cannabis prohibition. And there will be more information coming out in the weeks ahead on this talk. I may be biased because Craig had a great influence on me, but I think he's a heck of a speaker. He's really interesting and he's done some fascinating research. Our last public talk will be in April 30th, and that's going to be Dr. Amanda Ryman, who is in the School of Social Welfare at UC Berkeley. She's also the policy manager of California for the Drug Policy Alliance. She's going to be speaking on dispensary-based research, an untapped source. And that'll be the final public talk in our first annual speaker series. I also want to draw your attention to another event that is going to be coming up. It's sponsored as well by the Humboldt Institute for Interdisciplinary Marijuana Research, and that is an Earth Day Symposium on Marijuana and the Environment, which is going to be held here on the HSU campus April 19th and 20th. The focus of the symposium is communities and landscapes in the balance, the crossroads of environmental protection and marijuana agriculture. There is information about submitting panel ideas or registering for this event online. Again, humboldt.edu/DEE. I'm not sure what the DEE stands for, /HEMR. If you go to the Institute website, you can get more information about this event as well. And I want to just point out that both the speaker series and this symposium that's being planned for April are sponsored by the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences. So those are some things happening. Please visit us online, and there are things coming down the road that we're excited about, and I'm sure you'll be hearing about in the weeks and months ahead. So our speaker this evening is Jennifer Budwig, who is the Regional Area Manager for Redwood Capital Bank. She's been working in the banking industry for over 20 years. She serves on the Redwood Regional Economic Development Committee, the McLean Foundation Board, the Small Business Development Corporation? Center, thank you. Board, the Fortuna Sunrise Rotary Club. She chairs the Finance Committee for the Decade of Difference program and is an economic fuel judge. She's been honored by the State Assistance Fund for Enterprise Business and Industrial Development for outstanding support of the Small Business Loan Guarantee Program, and is also a graduate of Pacific Coast Banking School, which she earned honors in 2011. And I might add that Redwood Capital Bank has been a wonderful sponsor of many HSU activities, including the Humboldt Economic Index. And so I just wanted to add that. We're excited to, especially in this evolving climate with Washington and Colorado legalizing marijuana, and lots of questions that have been raised locally about what the potential impacts might be in Humboldt County. Just looking at the turnout tonight, I know a lot of people are interested to hear what Jennifer has to share on that. So without further ado, let's welcome Jennifer Budwig.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here this evening. Can you guys hear me okay? Is everyone okay? Okay, good. Well, he forgot the most important thing, and that's that I'm a Humboldt State University graduate. So it's nice to come back to my roots and be here speaking to you this evening. I wanted to go ahead and just give a little bit of background in regards to the research paper that I prepared. And what this is in regards to is, as he had mentioned, I graduated from Pacific Coast Banking School in 2011. It was a 3-year program, and as part of that program, we had to prepare a management paper which is comparable to a thesis. Through that process, we were able to choose our own topic, and we had to either write on something that was specific to the banking industry or write on something that was specific to our bank. And at that time, Proposition 19 had just been on the ballot. Even though it did not pass, it was definitely something that had a lot of people talking from the standpoint of, if it was approved, what would that mean to Humboldt County from an economic standpoint? Being in the banking industry, we have a lot of businesses that bank with us, and so their financial viability, of course, is very important to us, and that was the primary reason that I did this research paper. In all honesty, I didn't think that it would end up resulting in what it did from the standpoint of the interest of the community and just wanting to hear the results from what my actual conclusions ended up being. The purpose of the paper was initially just to be prepared for our board of directors at Redwood Capital Bank, but then it kind of took on a life of its own. There's been a lot of people that have asked me to present my findings, and it's actually been a very interesting process, and I was so glad that I chose this topic because it's so relevant to our economy and to our county. But additionally, it's such an ongoing, changing industry, and so many things are going on with it. So it's been something that, because I've been doing a lot of presentations, I've had the opportunity to continue to update my presentation and just stay current on all the events that are going on related to this particular topic. So the primary reason behind it was because looking at the probability of legalization increasing. Oh, I'm sorry. Can you get it up here?
Oh, if you hit the mute button, I'm sorry, I'm mute. Thanks, Jason.
Thank you. So as you know, 18 states plus Washington, D.C. have approved some medicinal use form. Proposition 19 failed in 2010, but the margin of it was 53.8% to 46.2%, so it actually was pretty close. Colorado and Washington approved the recreational marijuana use November of 2012. And I'm going to talk a lot about that because that, to me, has a significant impact on the future of what's going to transpire in Humboldt County specific to this industry. The tax revenues that can be generated for city, county, and state government agencies has garnered support. They've done a lot of studies on this and determined in terms of what the tax basis could mean to the different governments and those different levels in terms of financial support. So there were a lot of agencies that did put support behind it. Humboldt County has a large underground economy impacting all businesses and individuals. With legalization, there will be increased competition from large-scale corporations. Therefore, supply will increase, and in turn, prices will significantly decline, resulting in minimal profit margins and a loss of financial benefit to the Humboldt County producers. That's what the big fear is that if it is legalized and it gets to the point where they can actually farm it on a commercial basis, there's going to be such a huge supply that's going to be out there that in turn the price that it's sold for will continue to drop and those margins will continue to deteriorate. How will businesses be impacted financially if marijuana dollars are minimized or depleted from our economy? So I want to talk just real briefly about the round-trip dollar. The round-trip dollar is, and I'm going to relate it specifically to a marijuana situation. So if you have a marijuana grower, the typical outback marijuana farm costs about $30,000 to $40,000 to set up and operate, which includes irrigation hoses, camping equipment, and ongoing costs such as labor and food. So this money is spent either in a hydroponic supply store, an outdoor store, or a grocery store or a hardware store. In turn, this money is used to pay employees, cover overhead of the stores, provide donations back to our community, and so forth. Employees then spend a lot of this money in our local economy, which continues to circulate. So it's estimated that the round-trip dollar generally will go through an economy 6 to 7 times before it leaves the area. So someone coming in and setting up that farm, spending $30,000 to $40,000, even if it's not all spent here, say half of it's spent here, well, that's $15,000 that gets plugged into our economy that we wouldn't see otherwise. Then when they sell the crop, they've got that cash. They go out, they buy dinner, they buy some clothes, they might buy a truck, they might buy some real estate, they might buy some accessories for that big, huge four-wheel drive they drive around and spend a lot of money that way. So that's more money coming back into the economy. So that's why there's such a significance in terms of looking at that money that comes in to our county, circulates through our economy, and supports our businesses locally. So in doing this paper, I spent about 4 months writing it, and I was really fortunate to be able to have a lot of resources that were significantly helpful. I mean, I'll be honest with you, even though I grew up in Humboldt County, I was pretty oblivious to the magnitude of the marijuana industry that we have here within Humboldt. Some of the interviews that I held, one with Mike Downey, who is our current sheriff, and Gary Philp, who's our retired sheriff. Mike was a great resource. Wayne Hansen, I would say he was by far my best resource. He's a sergeant in criminal investigation division at Humboldt. He's been doing that for over 20 years, and he was just a wealth of knowledge. I mean, he's on the ground, he's out there, he's involved in the raids, he does the flyovers, he sees this going on every single day, and he was very forthcoming with information. He was by far the best person I ever could have talked to in writing this paper. I interviewed a former private investigator specializing in this industry who was actually hired by defense attorneys. So he worked specifically with marijuana growers, the larger ones, because they were the ones who were being arrested and sent to jail. Humboldt County supervisors, Clendenin and Lovelace. Lovelace because he's involved in on the state level with a group that is dealing with some of these marijuana issues. And then Cliff Clendenin because he's was a supervisor at my time, or down there in Fortuna, where I'm from. And so he also assisted in providing me information. And the marijuana growers, I was able to meet with 3 different marijuana growers and get some great insight from them, and hydroponic business owners. And then there were several television documentaries that were coming out at that time that include the following. And I taped those, and then I went back through them, took notes, went back through them again, took more notes. And it was just really interesting to see Humboldt County splashed on all these different documentaries, and the most recent one is Weed Wars. I don't know how many of you guys watched that one, but that's very insightful as well. And then newspapers, magazines, internet, and numerous media articles. The internet was a huge resource, of course, because there's so many things out there. And I was trying to be really careful in terms of the type of information I used, because some of it was, I wouldn't say is super credible. Sometimes you never know where your sources come from. So I really tried to stick to the ones like the New York Times, the LA Times, and media of that nature that I felt was credible in their information they provided. So some disclosures, certain parts of this analysis are somewhat subjective because of difficulty in obtaining hard data due to the black nature of the product, black market nature of the product. I do have some hard data that I will include in this presentation, but as you can only imagine that some of it had to be assumptions. This document doesn't reflect any opinion or viewpoint of Rebbe Capital Bank and so forth. This was just an independent paper that I chose to do on my own, so I just want to make sure that nobody affiliates this with Rebbe Capital Bank. And then the management paper that I actually prepared was submitted April of 2011, but as I stated earlier, I'm trying to keep this as updated as possible, so what I did was incorporated any current information into this presentation. So the first thing I want to look at, Humboldt County history. I think this is really pertinent to kind of understand where we were and where we are today. In the 1960s, we saw a pretty significant migration from the Bay Area of folks coming up to Humboldt County. The land was cheap, remote, rough terrain. It was an accepted culture. A lot of people say that folks from Haight-Ashbury moved this way. And so there was a lot of people that came up here and settled here. And it was, and I would say those were probably more the mom and pop operators in terms of, you know, they grew pot, but not on a large scale. They grew it for their own benefit, maybe sold a little bit of it, but it wasn't anything close to the magnitude of what is being grown out there today. Marijuana backfilled the gap left by failing industries like timber and fishing. I think that's huge because I don't think people really understand or can even begin to fathom how much. You know, the way I look at it is you have like a bucket, and as the timber and fishing monies continue to flow out of that bucket, the marijuana money came in to fill that bucket. And so what was happening was, because marijuana isn't on the radar so much from a legal standpoint, you're not seeing the actual dollars that can be traced in the county, but it was certainly something that I think saved this county from an economic standpoint, because if the timber and fishing industries would have just left here and that marijuana money would not have come in here, then I think that we would be in a significantly different situation than where we are today. So there was a focus on increasing yields and potency. THC, which is, the way I remember it, is Trinity, Humboldt County. And that is going to be what is your, what would you call it, your chemical in the plant that basically is going to determine your high, I guess is the way to put it. Sorry, sometimes I'm a little ignorant when I try to talk about this stuff. But in the 1960s, they were looking at marijuana that had THC contents of about 2 to 3%. Some people have told me that the best scientists on the planet live in Humboldt County because they're the ones who actually came to this county, and they're the ones who now produce marijuana that has 27 to 30% THC levels in it. So it is much more potent than it ever was before. And so, of course, with that means that you would have, you could have lesser amounts in accomplishing the same high that you would from larger amounts back in the 60s and even 70s. Increased indoor production. So we've seen a huge transition from a lot of outdoor to greenhouses and then a lot of indoor. The thing, and I had never really thought about this before, but the indoor production, truly that can be done anywhere. You know, I mean, I think with Humboldt, the environment was so ripe from the standpoint of you have great soil, you have great weather, it's a perfect place to grow marijuana, so that's a real competitive advantage Humboldt County has. But when now all of a sudden you're starting to see a lot more indoor production, but that can be done anywhere. So that's a little bit scary from the standpoint of, you know, basically that takes away any advantage we would have from a production standpoint. And it's funny because you talk to some people who are indoor growers and they feel they have a much more superior plant. It can be better monitored because of the climate control, and they can keep the critters out of it and that kind of thing. But then you talk to someone who's outdoor and they don't feel that that's the case at all. They feel outdoors much more superior because, you know, you have the natural light and that kind of thing. So I sense there was a little animosity there maybe between the two. Outdoor production, you can grow it cheaper, and again, that competitive advantage. But as you all know, even though your indoor production, it costs more to actually produce it. The flip side of that, of course, is you do sell it more in the secondary market. So we'll talk a little bit about supply, demand, and economics. From a supply standpoint, there's been a significant increase in supply over the last few years. So we have seen a glut on the market, which in turn has driven down prices. There's 5 primary reasons behind this increase in supply. The first thing was approval of Proposition 215. That happened in 1996. And previously, almost all of the marijuana consumed in the multi-billion-dollar U.S. market came from Mexico or Colombia at one time. But when Proposition 215 passed, as much as half is now produced domestically, and supply is at an all-time high. The primary reasons behind this, again, with the approval of 215, what this did was it created a quasi-legal status. And so a lot of people that maybe feared prior to 215 coming into place wouldn't grow because they were afraid of what would happen if they were caught by the feds or by police or whoever it might be. So with the approval of 215, you got your 215 card, and as long as you stayed compliant, then it took that fear away of ever being prosecuted. So that definitely increased production. Other states followed suit and passed their medicinal marijuana laws. So as I stated earlier, there's 18 states out there plus Washington, D.C. So within those states, now all of a sudden you start seeing a lot more growth within those states because they have their 215 cards. So the supply in all these different states has increased as well as it has in California. The 9/11 attacks, this is really interesting, something I hadn't thought about before, but since the 9/11 attacks in 2001, there's been a significant increase in border patrol. Customs and DEA cracked down at the borders, making it increasingly difficult to smuggle marijuana into the United States. So this resulted in the Mexican cartels relocating their grows directly into the United States on public lands. And we're starting to see a lot more of that. You're hearing that a lot, that the federal lands are being used for marijuana growth. Not everybody would agree that those are necessarily going to be all cartel-based, but when you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. So here they'd been growing in Mexico, and they were smuggling the marijuana in, and they were having to pay high transportation costs. They were having to take that risk of trying to get it across the border. They were having to, take the risk of transporting and getting caught. So now what they do is they just came in here and they grow in our same areas. They're able to produce a similar type of product where before theirs was much inferior to what's grown locally. They don't have those transportation costs, and they don't have that same fear of getting caught. So that was a huge part of the overall supply increases. And when you think about it, it actually makes a lot of sense for them just to come here, grow it, and then it takes a lot of the risk away from them. Fourthly, with Prop 19 on the ballot, there was a fear of producers that if this is approved, then this is going to be kind of a last hurrah for us. So a lot of them went out there and they grew way more than they had historically. So they doubled or tripled up their grows, thinking that, you know, this is not going to last very long and we're not going to be able to get these kinds of margins for very long. So what they did in turn was just grew a ton of it, and that also created a huge glut on the market. And then lastly, in 2009, President Obama signed a directive to the U.S. Department of Justice for them to defer to state laws regarding medical marijuana use. So this took the fear away that the DEA was going to do anything on a federal level. And I would say that was definitely something that was keeping people from growing because, and we're going to talk a lot about that because I think that's a huge piece of, you know, and going forward, how that will ultimately impact Humboldt County and especially how quickly we're going to see any changes here. So for all these reasons, the supply has escalated on a national level, and in turn, prices have continued to decrease. So this is the eradication factors on a national basis. So 2004 was 3 million plants, 2008, 8 million plants, 2009 hit a little over 10 million, 2010 was about the same, and then 2011, you see a change down to 6.7 million, which was a 35% decrease. In looking at the data on this, the reason that that happened was because California actually decreased significantly as far as how much they eradicated out of California. Out of those 6.7 million plants that had been ceased nationwide, 60% were from California. And that was actually, if you can read the fine print down there, 3.98 million plants were seized in California. The next nearest state was Tennessee, and 600,000 plants. So I thought that was really interesting. I didn't realize that California grew, well, one, it's a large state, of course, but it could mean that they're targeting this area a little bit more. I don't know. One thing Wayne Hansen said is that, you know, a lot of times we're always measuring the plants, but he said one of the things we have to take into consideration is that some of these plants they're getting nowadays are more like trees or very large bushes. So you might have a plant where, you know, one might yield a pound or half a pound or something like that. But he said some of these plants they're getting now are yielding 3-4 pounds. So they're much larger, much bigger scale than before. So even though it's saying, you know, 10.3 million plants, well, that could equate to 30 million in comparison to something back in 1970. These are the California camp eradication statistics. So I just graphed it so you could see the trend. And I believe you did have a speaker here who talked quite a bit about camp not that long ago, I think in November. But if you could see in 2000, it was about 400,000 plants. You can continue to see that trend as it goes upward. In 2010, well, 2009, 2010, it was actually, you know, hit that high point of just shy of 4.5 million plants. And then in 2011, it took a pretty big hit down to 2 million. The 2012 statistics are based on through 9/15 of 12. So that's not a full year. I would suspect that once that full year information is put in, that it's going to be probably pretty similar to what they did in 2011. When I originally did my paper, I had this graph in here, and I only had information through 2010. So it appears that, oh, their eradication is getting better, because if you look at that trend, you can see it increasing. The next slide is specific to Humboldt County. So same thing, it looks at, from 2000 on. Now 2007 was a little bit of an anomaly because there was one garden that they seized 160,000 plants. It was the largest garden that had ever been raided in the history of the nation. So if you take out those 160,000 plants, it brings it back down to about that 200,000 level. But you can see in 2011 and 2012 that the numbers started to drop again. So you might say, okay, well, you know, what's going on with eradication efforts? Well, through 2010, you might say, okay, that, you know, do we have an increase in supply, or is the eradication efforts getting better? But really, they're not. I mean, the resources have gotten cut back so significantly. A little bit of history on camp, but again, you already have a speaker, so I won't talk too much about that. But it originated in 1983. At that time, Humboldt County had 2 crews, 2 helicopters, and for 4 months out of the year. They had it during the peak season, so they had it from September through January. And so they had, pretty significant impact on what was being grown here. In recent years, they had 5 teams, each equipped with a chartered helicopter, but that covered 5 areas of the state. So as resources continue to dwindle, they continue to cut it back. And so what Humboldt County was getting was a lot less in terms of coverage from those helicopters. In 2012, mid-2012, the program was dropped altogether because of lack of funding. The DEA and the Forest Service are taking the lead role versus state authorities. So if you go back to the national eradication numbers, like I had said, in 2011 we saw a pretty significant drop of 35%. But again, that falls back to that decrease in California because, and a big part of it because of the elimination of camp. So now, and this is really interesting, now there are 3 zones in what they call the Cannabis Eradication and Reclamation Team, or they refer to it as CERT. What this equated to was having 3 days in Humboldt County that they actually had the helicopter here on the ground and actually eradicating pot. So in 2012, we had it for 3 days. So compare that to 1983 when we had 2 crews and 2 helicopters for 4 months. Pretty big difference. So now we're going to talk a little bit about demand. In 2010, there were 2.4 million persons aged 12 or older who used marijuana for the first time within the past year. This averages about 6,600 new users each day. I looked at a graph on that, and actually over the last 5 years, there hadn't been a significant change in that in terms of it didn't appear that more people were doing it, but there most definitely was not any decrease. California NORML estimates that as of April 2011, there have been between 750,000 to 1.1 million 215 cards issued in California. So that equates to 2 to 3% of the population, but there's an estimate that 2% was actually used for medicinal purposes, meaning 98% of the 215 cards that are issued are more for recreational use. And that was through a marijuana policy project that provided that data. Marijuana is the most widely used illicit drug in the U.S., with 6.9% of the population admitting to regular use. 1 out of 3 college kids consume cannabis. It's more socially acceptable since approved for medicinal purposes. And the USDA believes that demand for marijuana would skyrocket if it is legalized. So that's talking just a little bit about the supply and demand piece of it. So let's talk about the economic end of it. There's an increased supply that's resulted in decreased prices. So like I talked before about those 5 primary reasons as to why we've seen such a huge increase in supply. And these numbers are all based on wholesale. Wholesale equates to about 40% of retail. So if you were to take a plant here and you actually sold it in comparison to putting it down into smaller little baggies and selling it on the street, so you get about 40% of the value compared to if you took it to Florida and sold a pound there. So 10 years ago, indoor prices ran about $4,500 to $5,000. Outdoor ran about $3,500 to $4,000. About 5 years ago, indoor was about $4,000. Outdoor dropped from $2,800 to $3,500. Currently, indoor is approximately $2,500 and outdoor is about $1,500. Now, when I did this paper, so these were the numbers in 2011. My source did give me some updated numbers, so it's like current as of today. So she said it's about $2,200 to $3,000 a pound for indoor. So it really hasn't wavered from these numbers. It's pretty consistent. So it sounds like it's really been able to maintain its price over the last few years. So it's actually been, I feel it's been a benefit to Humboldt County that there hasn't been that we've seen this gradual decrease over time, because it allows us to be able to absorb those decreases in those margins and that money coming back into our economy. Compared to if this happened overnight, I think it would have been devastating. We wouldn't have had any time to adapt, but because of those decreases in prices, I know that what some people are doing is they're just growing more. So they're not seeing a real change in their overall income because they're just doubling up their crops. So they're making the same amount. But it's definitely going to impact overall discretionary income as those margins continue to decrease. So again, the wholesale is about 40% of retail. The cost to grow runs about 70 pounds to $400 a pound, and that's going to be based upon if you're looking at indoor versus outdoor. So this is about a 506% net margin in terms of your cost compared to your profits, or your cost compared to your gross sales. So there's a RAND study. It was a pretty extensive study, and what their estimate was that we would see a 90% decrease to the value if it was legalized. So right now, so say you're selling an outdoor product at $1,500, and if they're saying that, okay, you could see a 90% decrease in that, that's going to be a significant decrease to what your margins are. Because right now, this is an extremely profitable industry, as you can see. But if it was a situation where it was legalized, then they're estimating, again, 90% decrease. So what that would mean is we would see lost money coming into our economy, into Humboldt County. So there were some steps that I took for determining how much attributes to our economy. And the first thing I did, though, was I wanted to get an idea as far as how much gross marijuana is grown in Humboldt County. Because you hear all kinds of statistics, all kinds of numbers thrown out there. And so that was the first step I took. The second step was to determine how much of this money actually is spent in Humboldt County. Because even though you have a lot of marijuana growing out there, a lot of that money never hits the county. It's either exported out immediately, it's buried in backyards, it's, it's put in a U-Haul and taken out of the county, whatever it might be. So a lot of that money doesn't hit our county, but a lot of it does. And then third, and this was actually a step I hadn't anticipated when I started this paper, but as I continued to do my research, I realized that there are a lot of other variables that are going to attribute to what kind of short-term and long-term impacts we're going to see. So the first thing in determining gross annual income generated from marijuana sales. So multiple sources concur that we actually eradicate less than 5% of the marijuana that's growing out there. And if you remember that chart I showed you for Humboldt County, there was about 200,000 plants in terms of through 2010. We've seen that huge drop in the last 2 years because of the resources continuing to be cut back. I did talk to Wayne Hansen, and he said it's definitely not because there's less being grown out there. He said, if anything, there's way more pot being grown out there today than there was a few years ago. It's kind of interesting. He said one of his sergeants right now is doing some research, because you can use the Google Maps, you can go overhead, and what he's doing right now is he started at the south border of Humboldt County, and so far he's worked his way to Ferndale. So he's at Ferndale, and he's identified 3,100 gardens, and that's just outdoor. That is, well, outdoor and greenhouses. So that doesn't even include indoor, and he's just to Ferndale. So when you think about that, he still has all of the north end of the county to go and over towards the east side. So that was pretty mind-boggling to me. 3,100 gardens, I mean, that's a lot. And some of these are really, really large gardens. So Wayne's opinion is we're lucky if we're getting 5%. He said probably more like 3 would be his guess. When I did this analysis, I used 25%, which is extremely conservative. But as you can see throughout this whole process, I did take conservative measures kind of at every point that I could. So based on Humboldt County plants seized in 2010 of 203,000 plants, because that's when I did the analysis, then what that would equate to is if we actually got 25% of the plants and there was 200,000 plants eradicated, that's going to equate to 800,000 plants being grown in Humboldt County. So indoor and outdoor production is going to vary. So what I did was I took, the Sheriff's Department provided me with a breakdown of how much was indoor, how much was outdoor. And there was a lot of other information involved in that too. It was really interesting just in terms of like what kind of real property they seized and things of that nature, how much of it was actually dried marijuana versus not, how much was plants and so forth. But what I tried to do is I took that percentage split in terms of how much was indoor eradicated, how much was outdoor, and stuck to that and applied it accordingly. Indoor gardens, they yield smaller plants with shorter cycles, but they usually get 3 crops a year. It takes about 10 plants to yield 1 pound. I think this might be changing a bit. Outdoor gardens yield larger plants, averaging 1 pound per plant, but 1 crop per year. And then prices used for current market with indoor at $2,500 a pound and outdoor at $1,500 a pound. So I'm not going to go through all of this, but you can kind of get an idea in terms of what my process was. So I looked at the indoor plants, what that's going to equate to, and then I looked at the outdoor plants, what that would equate to, and it ends up being $1 billion gross. Now again, that's based on 25% eradication, and I don't even think that's close. I think it's way, 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 that number's going to be way higher. If you run it at 10%, it equates to $1.6 billion. And like I was saying in my conversation with Wayne Hansen, he said we're not even getting 5%. So you can only imagine what the magnitude is in terms of how much marijuana is being grown out there in Humboldt County. The second step I took was, okay, get an idea gross, now look at how much is actually being spent in this county. And so to do this, and this was pretty challenging because it's really, it's a very subjective approach, but I think it does have some merit to it. But what I did, the theory behind it is comparing Humboldt County's taxable sales to total personal income, and then comparing those to other counties, and then look at how that compares, and then what that would result in comparison to how much money is determined to be being spent in our county that's not accounted for from a income tax standpoint. So what I did was I actually took all 58 counties, and then I got all the data for those, and it included taxable sales, it included personal income, population, and unemployment rates. And then I tried to find the counties that were most comparable to Humboldt. And then from there, I actually went in and did the calculation of those ratios and compared them to Humboldt. The 4 counties I used was Nevada, El Dorado, Kings, and Madera. And then this is so this shows you what the percentages are. So Humboldt was pretty high at 42%. Well, we'll go down to 2008. And that was because that was the most current data I had at that time. So it was 39%. And what that is taking, so Humboldt County taxable sales at that point were 1.6 billion, and then Humboldt County personal income was 4.3 billion. So it's just a matter of taking the taxable sales divided by personal income, and then doing the same for every one of those counties. So you can see the different ratios here. Now, if you look at Humboldt and you do a comparison to El Dorado, Kings, Madera, and Nevada, the average on those 4 counties is 33%. So in turn, what I did was I took Humboldt, and I said, okay, to get to that 33%, which is the average of those other 4 counties, what is that going to mean? So that was my second step. Again, 33% was average. So what that ended up meaning was that Humboldt County's income should have equated to $5.12 billion to come up with that 33%. So what that ends up equating to is a difference of $833 million. So what that says in a nutshell is that $833 million was spent in Humboldt County that was unreported income. And then again, like I said, I was trying to be conservative on this. So, some people might say, well, that could be tourist dollars. People coming in from out of the area and spending their money here. So I went ahead and just lopped that in half and said, okay, we'll use 50% of that. So I used a number of $415 million. And what that actually ends up equating to is 26% of Humboldt County's economy. Cross-check, there was something, and this was a few years ago, but HSU economists, their guesstimate at that point was that marijuana accounts for between 500 million and 700 million of the county's economy. After considering the trickle-down effect, they estimate it to be closer to $1 billion. So that's that round-trip dollar I was talking about. Now, the third step, other variables attributing to short-term and long-term impacts. This is something that, like I was saying, when I initially was doing the paper, I hadn't really thought about there being a lot of other variables. But as I went through this process, I realized that, there definitely were. First of all, if it's legalized, we have to look at how it's legalized and when it's legalized. So if it's approved as a proposition without assisted state laws, like Proposition 215 was, that's going to be a whole lot different than if it's approved as a proposition with assisted state laws. So if Prop 19 had passed as proposed, it would have taken years for 58 counties and hundreds of municipalities to incorporate regulation of marijuana into local ordinances. If it's approved this way, similar to Prop 215, and details are left up to local entities, there will be a high probability it would be quite some time before there's a consistent, uniform governing body to enforce the monitoring of its sale, production, and use. A few years ago, the Americans for Safe Access showed that in California, 46 cities and 10 counties allow the drug, 178 cities and 20 counties don't, and the rest have temporary measures or none at all. So that means a business could be complying with state rules but violating a local ordinance and breaching federal law. So I was talking with Sheriff Downey about this because when I did my paper, at that time, they were looking at possibly implementing something comparable to Mendocino. And I'm going to talk here in a minute about what Mendocino had going on. And they were actually looking at doing something along those lines. They since chosen not to, which was probably a really good choice. But he said as of now, in fact, I actually talked to him this morning, and he goes, well, take your pen, and he goes, put it on your paper and draw a big fat 0. And that's where we're at. he said it's been so challenging because they're trying to come up with an ordinance that's fair. He said that they just keep spinning their wheels. He said right now everyone's really gun shy because of what's going on in Mendocino. He said they continue to try to come up with something, but he said that as of right now they really don't have anything in effect. So in regards to backing up to that prior bullet point, approved as proposition with assisted state laws. So that's looking at what provisions will be included in the approval. So how much, who can sell it, how much can be sold, how much will the taxes be, what are the limitations on type, and so forth. And if it's approved as a proposition with assisted state laws and regulations, then there will be more uniformity on a state level and a broader, more structured oversight. So for example, with Proposition 19, when that was going on the ballot, there's a gentleman, Tom Amiano, who's an assemblyman. He actually was trying to get supporting legislation so that it would be in effect and ready to go if Prop 19 passed. And that's what Colorado did in terms of trying to make sure that they had some things in place when theirs went on the ballot. So how long will it remain, I'm getting ahead of myself, how long will it remain illegal in other states? Obviously Colorado and Washington, the two states that have legalized recreational marijuana, are now deciding how to build regulatory systems for growers and distributors. Washington, their initiative was 502 and it legalized up to 1 ounce of marijuana, created a system of state licensed growers, processors, and retail stores. There's no home growing and there's the DUI standard designed to be comparable to the .08 limit for blood alcohol content. It passed at 56%. Colorado was Amendment 64. That does allow home growing and does not include a drunk driving standard. And that passed with 55%. I'll talk more about that because there's going to be some interesting stuff that's going to transpire over the next few months in regards to Colorado and Washington. So what will the DEA and Fed stance be? And will the Justice Department try to block the measures from taking effect? So when I originally was doing this, again, it was 2011. And so in my paper, I had stated that if it is approved, these are basically the three possibilities that I saw as happening. First, they'll either allocate more resources to prosecuting violators of federal policy, or the federal government will launch a lawsuit against the state and try to block it, or they'll receive directive from the DEA that they will not pursue anyone compliant with the state law. So now that Colorado and Washington have approved it, we can see how the feds are going to respond to that, which is going to be significant in terms of how things progress and going forward. So the biggest variable to me that could slow the erosion of the black market in Humboldt County is if the DOJ and the DEA strongly fight the state's approvals and either sue or enforce with regulatory laws. If this happens, then the progression of large-scale manufacturers will take longer because of legal concerns, and the small producers will not be squeezed out as quickly. So based on a New York Times article dated December 6th of 2012, so this was just a couple months ago, some of the possibilities that they cited state, even as marijuana legalization supporters are celebrating their victories in the two states, the Obama administration has been holding high-level meetings since the election to debate the response of federal law enforcement agencies to the decriminalization efforts. Federal officials caution that the issue has raised complex legal and policy considerations, including enforcement priorities, litigation strategy, and the impact of international anti-drug treaties that remain unresolved and that no decision was imminent. One option is to sue the states on the grounds that any effort to regulate marijuana is preempted by federal law. Should the Justice Department prevail, it would raise the possibility of striking down the entire initiatives on the theory that voters would not have approved legalizing the drug without tight regulations and licensing similar to controls on hard alcohol. Another option is for federal prosecutors to bring some cases against low-level marijuana users that until now they have rarely bothered with, waiting for a defendant to make a motion to dismiss the case before the drug is now legal in that state. The department then could obtain a court ruling, federal law trumps the state law. A more aggressive option is for the Justice Department to file lawsuits against the states to prevent them from setting up systems to regulate and tax marijuana, as the initiative is contemplated. If a court agrees that such regulations are preempted by federal ones, it will open the door to a broader ruling about whether the regulatory provisions can be severed from those eliminating state prohibitions, or whether the entire initiatives must be struck down. And then another potential avenue would be to cut off federal grants to the states unless their legislatures restored anti-marijuana laws. In an interview with Barbara Walters, President Obama stated, what I think it's, and this interview was December 19th of 2012, so it was just a couple months ago after these had passed. What I think is that at this point, you've seen the voters speak on this issue for Washington and Colorado. And as it is, the federal government has a lot to do when it comes to criminal prosecutions. It does not make sense from a prioritization point of view for us to focus on recreational drug users in a state that has already said under state law that's legal. So you hear that and you kind of think, well, maybe they're going that direction to go ahead and just, let them comply with state law and let them move forward. But you'll see as we get a little further into this that that had also been the case for California, but that changed as well. So you probably want to keep an eye on that because what their determination is really going to set a precedence in what happens with other states and going forward. So let's talk a little bit about the historical federal government response. First of all, marijuana is considered a Class 1 drug by the federal government, so they treat it the same as heroin and cocaine. So as I had stated earlier in regards to supply, the fear of the DEA was taken away when Obama signed a directive in October 2009 addressed to the U.S. Department of Justice to deter to state laws. It advised U.S. attorneys in medical marijuana-approved states to not pursue individuals who are compliant with state laws. When this happened, this was significant because what this told a lot of people is that, okay, as long as I comply with my state laws and within my 215 card rights, then the feds are not going to bother me. And to a degree, I think that did happen, but there were definitely a few cases along the way. Like I recall a gentleman down in San Francisco. He did an interview with a newspaper. They came in, they took a picture of his pretty little garden, and he was talking about how his little plants are so pretty and growing so well, and he was all excited, and he had his 215 card. Well, the DEA showed up on his doorstep about a week later, and they took all his pretty little plants, and they hauled him off to jail, and now he's looking at 20 years in jail. And so they basically, and then they had a gentleman from the DEA came on, and he said, well, when he's going to sit there and he's going to flaunt it in front of us like that, what does he expect us to do? And so I think because, he was very high profile, that they took action against him. So even though this was the directive, there still was some federal interaction at certain points. So, but in June of 2011, we saw a significant change. There was a federal and DEA pushback. I want to talk a little bit about that because I think that's really important. So after 2009, people are cruising along. They're thinking, okay, I'm compliant with state law. I'm doing great. I can, as long as I've got my 215 card. Well, then what happened was the Obama administration decided to toughen its stand on medical marijuana. So, and that was on multiple fronts, multiple agencies, including the FBI, the DEA, the IRS, and the EPA. The DOJ issued a memo that redefined caregiver, and the department threatened to take action against pot dispensaries, even in states that had legalized medicinal pot. The Obama administration was really criticized because of this, and they asked, the question in regards to, well, you said that, in 2009, you gave a directive for him to leave us alone. And so when Obama was questioned on his change of position, he said, what I specifically said was we were not going to prioritize prosecutions of persons who are using medical marijuana. I never made a commitment that somehow we were going to give carte blanche to large-scale producers and operators of marijuana, and the reason is because it's against federal law. I can't nullify congressional law. I can't ask the Justice Department to say ignore completely a federal law that's on the books. What I can say is use your prosecutorial discretion and properly prioritize your resources to go after things that are really doing folks damage. As a consequence, there haven't been prosecutions of users of marijuana for medical purposes. So basically what he was saying in a nutshell was that he's still standing behind, it's okay for medicinal use, but he's supporting what's going on with this change of direction in the administration. October 8th, 2011, the 4 California U.S. attorneys held a press conference, and they announced they were going to have a crackdown on medical marijuana businesses, and a lot of letters to dispensaries were issued. How many of you guys heard about the letters that went out to the dispensaries? Yeah, most of you did, because some of them in Arcata got them. And so what happened was these letters, what they did was they were sent out to landlords, they were sent out to the business owners, they were sent out to any mortgage holders on the property, and what they did was they targeted businesses that were within 1,000 feet of schools and playgrounds. and parks. So the idea was they wanted to get the dispensaries away from where kids were. So they went ahead and they issued these letters, basically said, if you guys don't shut this dispensary down within a certain period of time, then we may come in and seize your assets. Also, you may have to pay back all the rents you received from that dispensary from the time that it was open and operating there, and we may take criminal action against you. It was very effective. They actually, Dan Rush, who's an official at the United Food and Commercial Workers Union, said about 650 out of the 1,400 marijuana dispensaries that existed in 2012 have ceased operation. The workers showed up one day at work, and it was July 2012, and they had these notices on their doors, and they basically said that they had to shut down their operation. The landlords received these notifications, and so they immediately gave them eviction notices. But then what ended up happening was so this went further to court because Harborside refused to shut down. And so what ended up happening was that October of 2012, the city of Oakland also stepped up to support Harborside, and they filed a suit against the federal government in relation to targeting the marijuana facilities. And then January 8th of 2013, so just last month, a federal magistrate ruled that Harborside Health Center can continue to operate. They do not need to shut down, in spite of Harborside's landlords calling on the court to order an immediate halt. They said that it is the role of the government, not Harborside's landlords, to determine whether the business should be shut down for its alleged violation of the Controlled Substances Act. So that was a victory for Harborside, but then February 19th, the same magistrate judge came back and dismissed the city of Oakland's lawsuit. So they said, you can't sue these guys. So they kicked that out. But this is an ongoing deal that I just found it really interesting because I think Harborside, I'm going to mention them again in a minute, but they definitely have been targeted. There's no doubt about that. The next thing I want to hit on is the IRS tax code 280E. How many of you out there have heard of this tax code? Okay, so this tax code, this is really interesting stuff. This code was put on the books in 1982 by Ronald Reagan, and that's when he declared a war on drugs. It basically doesn't allow deducting expenses incurred by any business trafficking in controlled substances prohibited by federal law. So in a nutshell, what this means is that any business that is considered trafficking in drugs could not write off any operating expenses through their business. So what that means is these dispensaries that are filing their tax returns, they fill out their tax return, they have your revenues, and you have your expenses, you have your net income, and then you send in your payments on your taxes. Well, what happened was the IRS went in and they audited a lot of these dispensaries. They're still in the process of doing it. And they came back and they said, well, I'm sorry, but you can't write off any of those operating expenses, so you have to pay taxes on your gross revenues. So they handed Harborside a bill for $2.5 million, and they said for 2007 and 2008, you owe us that much for those 2 years. And again, they cited this tax code. So they're doing that with a lot of the dispensaries down in the Bay Area right now, so that's all in process. So it's going to be really interesting to see the outcome of that. The next thing, Mendocino County's 9.31 county ordinance. This is the one I was talking about earlier. So this is, again, very interesting. So in March of 2010, Mendocino County passed an ordinance that allowed medical marijuana cultivators to get permitted to grow up to 99 marijuana plants per parcel. They called it the zip tie program. I'm sure a lot of you probably have heard about it. The only ordinance in California that makes it legal to be a cannabis farmer. So they were the first county to actually legalize it in that regard. So you would go in, you get your permits, they would come out and, you have your zip ties on your plants, they would make sure everything was kosher, everything looked legit, you paid your fine for your permit, and you were good to go. And again, that was March of 2010, that went into place. October 12th of 2011, which was about a week after the U.S. Justice Department made its announcement that they were cracking down on the marijuana industry, they went and raided Matthew Cohen. He was the owner of Northstone Medical Marijuana Cooperative in Mendocino County, and he was the poster child for Mendocino's 9.31 program. He was the first person to do it. He was the one who basically was kind of their guinea pig. He went through the whole process. He was doing everything exactly right. He had his 99 plants. He had his zip ties. He was in compliance all the way around. And they came in, they raided him, the feds raided him, basically took his 99 plants, and now he's looking at jail time because of it. So a lot of medicinal marijuana advocates suspect that the federal agents chose him because he's been in the limelight a lot. He's an advocate of regulation, and he's been included in a lot of television documentaries as well as news articles and news articles relating to medicinal marijuana. So he's been flying pretty high on the radar. Then January 24th of 2012, they changed the ordinance in Mendocino County, and they changed it down to where you could have 25 marijuana plants. They disbanded basically the program, aside from allowing that many plants. If you were a co-op, you could have up to 99, but they would no longer grant these permits to growers. And come to find out, I guess, the statement that was made by Janine Nadell, who was Mendocino County's counsel, said, "I feel comfortable by eliminating the 99 plant exemption in the permitting process, the county's in a better position." The Mendocino County Board of Supervisors changed their medical marijuana regulation to thwart off threats from federal officials. Although Nadell declined to comment on the extent of federal threats, according to 5th District Supervisor Dan Hamburg, last month the U.S. Federal Attorney Melinda Haig paid a visit to Nadell and threatened to file an injunction against Mendocino County's 9.31 medical marijuana regulation, then go after the local authorities. Again, if you remember, I was saying in Humboldt County they were looking at mirroring what Mendocino was doing, but after all of this transpired, they put the skids on really fast. So in an October 2011 press conference, Melinda Haig was very clear she would use RICO, which is the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act statutes, against public officials who promulgate laws that are found to be in violation of the Controlled Substance Act. By accepting money from pot growers, could Mendocino County officials be liable under RICO violations? So December 2nd of 2012, which again was just a couple months ago, so they thought that this was behind them by disbanding the program. Apparently they received, Melinda Haig's office told the county that they had to completely end the program or face possible litigation, and then after some debate the supervisors decided to effectively gut the program. But then what happened was, let me back up on that. So they went ahead and they disbanded the program, but then early December of 2012, they ended up getting a grand jury indictment that, or they issued subpoenas to Sheriff Allman, his captain who oversaw the permitting program, the financial manager for the sheriff's office, and the county auditor and controller. The order calls for the officials to hand over all records related to the program. So again, that was just December 2012. So they're going after them again and subpoenaing all their records. So the county's hired a San Francisco attorney to help represent it. They said no one really knows what the feds are after, but Dan Hamburg feels that what they're trying to do is get the money that the county received for the permit processing, which was a little over $1 million. So that was the money they collected from granting those permits. So they think that they may be trying to recoup that. So that's something that's continuing to happen. It sounds like there might be some fear that the individuals that were involved in making those decisions could be concerned that they might personally be prosecuted. And then the last one I want to talk about is Richard Lee, who is the founder of Amsterdam University, and he was a strong advocate of Prop 19. He put about $1 million into Prop 19 getting it on the ballot. When it failed, they went to him and they said, you know, what do you think about this? And he said, well, he goes, I'm going to find out why it failed, and then I'm going to bring it back in 2012, and I'm going to make sure it's written so that the people pass it. So he's been a really strong advocate behind getting marijuana approved. Well, ironically, April of 2012, the DEA, the IRS, and U.S. Marshals came in and basically invaded his home, his shop. He had a dispensary, and then also Amsterdam University, and shut the whole thing down. So it completely tied up all of his assets, all of his finances, and he had no access to money anymore. So that pretty much put the skids on him. And as you all saw in 2012, it was not back on the ballot. So the reason that I'm talking about this so much, this federal law piece of it, because it's so significant. And when you go back to what's going on in Washington and Colorado right now, so yeah, they've legalized it, but it's also from a recreational standpoint. That basically means you can have an ounce of marijuana on you. So even if the feds kind of back off in that regard, it still doesn't give them the blessing to go out and mass produce, you know, huge farms of marijuana. And so, and I'll tell you why a lot of people aren't going to do that. First of all, the federal law, this is what the federal law is for possession of marijuana. So any amount your first offense, you get up to a year in jail, $1,000 fine. Second offense, 15 days is mandatory, and it's $2,500 fine. Any subsequent offense, 90 days mandatory, up to 3 years minimum or maximum, and a $5,000 fine. So that's just possession. Now look at sale. So if you're busted for selling marijuana, it's automatically a felony, and if it's within 1,000 feet of a school, park, or playground, your fine's going to be doubled. I had to do the math on this one, because less than 50 kilograms, which equates to 110 pounds, up to 5 years and a $250,000 fine. 50 to 99 kilograms, which the 99 kilograms equates to 218 pounds, up to 20 years in jail and a $1 million fine. You're selling 100 to 999 kilograms, which equates to 2,200 pounds, 5 years mandatory and up to 40 years and a $500,000 fine. And 1,000 kilograms or more, which is 2,200 pounds or more, 10 years mandatory up to life and a $1 million fine. So that's for selling it. And then cultivation is pretty similar to sale. It's all based on plants though. So less than 50 plants, 5 years max. 50 to 99 plants, 20 years max. 100 to 999 plants, 5 years mandatory up to 40 years, and a $500,000 fine. But this is the biggie. If you have over 1,000 plants, I'm sorry, that's not the biggie. That's pretty big, but it's not quite the biggie. 1,000 plants, 10 years mandatory up to life, and a $1 million fine. This is the biggie. If you have over 60,000 plants and you're determined to be part of a continuing criminal enterprise, you could get the death penalty. So that's one of the reasons that I don't see a lot of people going into mass, huge production of marijuana. If it's even if in Washington and Colorado, if the feds back off a little bit, I think that they're going to probably look at doing something similar to what they've done in California, just in terms of trying to come in, put the hammer down, say, you know what, you guys, this is getting out of control. Because I think that's what was happening with the dispensaries, was that the intent was, you know, they were okay with a few dispensaries opening up here and there, but then all of a sudden they have, you know, over 1,500 dispensaries in California and massive amounts of marijuana being run through them, massive amounts of money being run through them, and just a huge amount of these 215 cards being issued. And so I think that's why they came in and you know, basically said, hey, we're the feds. At the end of the day, we're the ones who actually are the ones with the hammer. And so they were continuing to exercise that. So if anybody knows what federal law is, which of course I'm sure that if you were going to go out and grow 1,000 plants, you probably would want to look into that. But the bottom line is, if you're busted on a federal basis, then this is what you would be looking at. And so that's one of the things too, I think that locally they're trying to bring more federal enforcement in versus local. You know, if you were growing 1,000 plants today and you got busted for it, you probably would end up with probation if you were prosecuted within Humboldt County. But if you were actually prosecuted by the DEA's office in the federal level, then, you know, you'd be looking at more along the lines of possible 10 years mandatory up to life. You know, so huge difference in terms of the federal law in comparison to state law or local law. So that's why I hit on that and talked about that so much, because I think that that in itself is going to prevent a lot of people from going out and doing any kind of mass production of marijuana. So this is kind of summary and conclusions. Marijuana cultivation significantly contributes to the economy of Humboldt. There's no doubt about that. About $1 billion gross annually. I do think it's significantly more than that. 416 million spent in Humboldt County annually, so that equates to about 20% of our economy. Again, I do think it's probably more than that. If legalized and commercialized, these dollars will not disappear overnight, but we'll eventually see a dwindling these monies. I don't see anything in a short term being significant because of all the reasons I've talked about, but and then with pot prices already coming down because of increased supply, there's been cushion to the erosion, but many feel this is just the beginning. Based on the current margins, there's still room for further decreases. As you can see, there's still a huge profit margin built in there. Short term, probably minimal impact, but long term has the potential to be devastating. A lot of organizations are coming together advocating Humboldt County being proactive and creating a niche to retain some of this market. As an example, organic, outdoor, that kind of thing. So nobody really knows for sure when and how hard Humboldt will be impacted if it's legalized. I think so much of it's going to be dependent upon, it'll be very interesting to see what the feds do over the next few months and how they respond to Colorado and Washington, because I think that's going to set a precedence that we're going to see for other states. And if they, come in with a heavy hammer, then that's going to continue to drive everything back underground. If they come in and they say, that's fine as long as you comply with state law, then I think that that's going to be completely different. But until it's legalized on the federal level, we're not going to see huge, gigantic mass productions of commercial marijuana. You hear these stories about the tobacco farms have already gone and bought up all this land and they're poised and ready to roll. So when it does become legalized, they can come in and make their fortune. And I have no doubt that that probably will happen someday, but we don't know if that's 10 years down the road, 20 years down the road, 50 years down the road, or 5 years down the road. So a lot of it is just going to be dependent upon truly what the feds do and their direction in going forward. I think that was, oh, there we go. Federal government stance and direction will be significant. So are there any questions?